Heather Cox Richardson, welcome to our program.
It's always a pleasure.
First and foremost, the Supreme Court decision essentially throwing the case on Trump's immunity back to the lower courts and somehow being unable to decide whether or not the president is immune on certain issues. How do you read that decision coming at the very end of their term?
I think it's important to remember two things. First of all, by delaying that decision as long as they did, they made sure that, in fact, former President Donald Trump would not see a trial before the upcoming election, putting a really big thumb on the scale for that election. So that's an important thing to remember. It's also important to remember that it comes after two other big decisions, one that threw out the Chevron doctrine, and one that essentially okayed bribery so long as the exchange of money or favors came after an official had decided something. So in the space of a week, we've had the idea that essentially bribery, they call it gratuities, but essentially it's bribery after the fact, was established by the Supreme Court. And next we got what is essentially the throwing out of the modern state, the regulatory American state, which will dramatically benefit the very wealthy and corporations. And now we have the idea that, in fact, the president is immune from prosecution for things he did as what he calls official acts. This is a coup. It's a coup, and that's a legal coup in our system. And it is, as you say, interesting that it's happening right before July 4th, when, of course, the founders of what would become the United States published the Declaration of Independence that said that the United States would not have a king.
And what will happen if you fast forward and Trump has talked about retribution? Is this now set for the foreseeable, that these parties, these presidents will, this political retribution is now baked in?
Christiane, I don't think we know what the future is going to look like, because we have never been here as a country. That being said, I think there's two real problems with the way that Americans are looking at this situation. And that is, really, we have honored our Constitution for 248 years. And since World War II, Americans believe that the system as we have it is going to survive. They just don't think the world that we lived under after World War II is going to go away. And it's going to be a huge shock to them to discover that it is. I also think that in the period really since at least 1980, there has been a movement toward this idea of an imperial presidency. And it's going to be the project of the next 5 months to convince Americans that this is our moment. If we do not step up now and stop this, it will not be stopped in my lifetime anyway.
And, Justice Sotomayor, she said, never in the history of our republic has a president had reason to believe that he would be immune from criminal prosecution if he used the trappings of his office to violate the criminal law. So, of course, she dissented. As a way of asking the actual question to you, what would have happened to Richard Nixon? Would he have been immune for what he did as president in the Watergate situation?
If you listen very carefully, you can hear him spinning in his grave, because had he had this ruling on the table, he would absolutely have skated. What really has frightened me in the last week, more even than the Supreme Court decision, was the reaction of the American media to the event that happened on last Thursday in Atlanta that was televised by CNN. And what the problem for me about that was not that Biden was stumbling over his words as he tried to get out the different things that his administration had done. And it was not even that Trump showed us who he was, because those of us who've been paying close attention for a while knew that he has deteriorated in the time since he's been in office, knew that people didn't know how bad he was, know that he is a pathological liar, and that he is refusing to accept the norms or the guidelines of our democracy. We knew that. What shocked me was the degree to which the American media looked at those two people, and rather than saying, this is what is happening on that stage, we have these two characters, or even worse than saying, what is happening on that stage is looking at a former president talking about destroying American democracy. What they did was they presented to the American people that the central problem of what happened on that stage was Joe Biden's age, when he's 3 years older than the man on the other side who wants to destroy American democracy.
So, Heather, after that debate, there has been, from party grandees to obviously the media grandees, to a whole load of people, including grassroots. As CBS poll said, something like 72% of those who were polled after the debate say Biden should step down. Are they wrong?
I think there are a couple of things going on. One of them is that structurally, and again, as I just said to someone, my interest is not in Biden or Kamala Harris or Trump or whomever he might choose as his vice president. My interest is less in them than in the long-term sweep of American history. I want the whole picture. And in the whole picture of American history, if you change a presidential nominee at this point in the game, the candidate loses. And it loses for a number of reasons. First of all, because the apparatus of the party for the election is set up around somebody else. Second of all, because the news is only going to report all the growing pains of a brand new campaign, including all the opposition research that the opponents are then going to throw at people.
And the only time in recent memory that's happened was when President Johnson decided not to take up the nomination of his party. And that was, frankly, if you remember, he's something like, the saying went, if I've lost Walter Cronkite over Vietnam, then I've lost the American people. So there is precedent to this. But as you say, then the replacement candidate did lose.
That's correct. And again, there are some parallels there in that one of the things that Democrats were furious about in that election of 1968 was that they hadn't voted for the person who was at the top of the ticket, Hubert Humphrey, at that point. And in this case, of course, the primary voters in the Democratic Party, who are the most loyal people, have voted, and they voted for Joe Biden. For all the people are focusing on Biden right now, and as you mentioned, I'm a historian of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is in crisis. And they are as well doing something unprecedented, which is trying to run for president somebody who not only has 34 criminal convictions, but also tried to overthrow the will of the people in the 2020 presidential election. So I think that, again, right now, I think the idea that the focus is on Biden is a bit misguided, at least from my perspective, because I don't care if we elect Biden or Harris or anybody else. I care that we recognize that running currently against that ticket is somebody who is trying to destroy our country. And I don't think I'm the only one who feels that way. And after the July Republican National Convention, the American narrative is going to look very different.
That's really interesting. And just to contextualize what you just said, on the debate stage, Trump refused to say that he would accept the result of the future election. Only he said if it was fair and legal. He also talked about an economy that all reasonable economists say would jack up inflation, and essentially an import tax would be a tax on the American people, those tariffs. So on and on, he was saying things that experts have said would actually not work to the benefit of most of the American people who he claims to be representing.
Well, again, right now, and I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing that the focus is on the Democrats and grappling with the one key weakness of this ticket, which is Biden's age. But people are somehow erasing from their minds the fact that the Democratic ticket, which, by the way, also has really a fabulous set of cabinet officers and has had, as I say, this extraordinarily successful administration, is trying to run against a party that has no plans that people like. They're doubling down on a nationwide abortion ban. We know that 70% of Americans want protections for abortion enshrined in our national law. They're doubling down on protecting the idea that anybody can own a gun, when almost 80% of Americans would like common sense gun safety legislation. They're doubling down on tax cuts for corporations. That too is extraordinarily unpopular.
Finally, you have sat down face to face with Joe Biden. Was the man on Thursday the man that you know?
No, but no. I mean, he's clear. He has utter command of what he's talking about and so on. But I want to emphasize, to my mind, my impression of him is right. It's what I've seen. he bears responsibility for that performance on the stage. I don't want to make excuses for him. That's not the way this game is played. What I would say, though, is it is a mistake to look at him and say, oh, we've got a problem, and not to look at Trump and say the same thing. And then to look at their performance in that office and say, we would rather have the man who couldn't get anything done and who really just worked with other authoritarians around the world than the man who has really managed to protect American manufacturing and so on. So I care deeply that the American people have an entire picture of what is at stake in this election. And where we are right now after that debate is not giving us that picture. It is my expectation, following the Supreme Court's recent decisions, that that balance may be restored. But if it isn't restored from the higher reaches of our government and from the media, the American people sure better do it themselves, because we have 5 months to make sure we get to the 250th anniversary of the American Republic. And if we don't come out right in November, we're not going to make it.
Well, that is a dramatic way to end this interview. Heather Cox Richardson, thank you so much for your analysis and your historical perspective.
Thank you for having me.